very good evening. Thank you for joining us here on ET Now. You're watching India Tonight. I'm Nivedna, Prabhu, and joining me is my co-host Jude. In fact, today we put the spotlight on the big development given the fact that the 25th SCO Summit in China has sparked a global debate. Can India and China truly come together after years of tension? In fact, as we speak about that as well, let's tell you more on that front, because while we put that into context, we unpack the Modi and the Xi meeting and its implications. Because remember, this week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping shared warm words and a handshake, their first bilateral in China in 7 years. Against the backdrop of US tariffs hitting both nations, 50% on Indian exports, threats of 200% on Chinese, and Modi called India and China development partners, not rivals, while of course she pitched a dragon-elephant tango. Remember, they agreed to maintain border peace, resume direct flights, revive the Kailash Manasarovar pilgrimage, and boost trade in rare earths and infrastructures. The SCO itself, representing 42% of the world's population, pushed for an anti-West stance, with Modi embracing Russia's Putin and aligning on counter-terrorism. But is this a genuine thought? Because on one hand, shared pressures from US tariffs and a history of course, disputes suggests pragmatism. Since the 2024 border petrol deal, we have seen incremental steps, ministerial visits, disengagement talks, and a $99 billion trade relationship. China wants to grow. Yet, the 3,800-kilometer disputed border remains unresolved, with China's new dam threatening India's Brahmaputra River. Now, China's backing of Pakistan during the 2025 India-Pakistan conflict fuels mistrust, and India's quad ties with US and Japan signal no full pivot to China. Social media, in fact, rather on X, is split. Some see a new beginning, others call it optics for Trump's tariffs. So we decode that tonight, both Jude and I, but let me take that opportunity to be introducing our guest joining us this evening, Professor Madhav Nalapat, Vice Chair, Manipal Advanced Research Group, as well as Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow, ORF. Good evening, both of you. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for taking the time out and joining both Jude and I this evening. Mr. Nalapat, let me begin with you. Given, what we've seen over the years in terms of the China and India relations, which was, of course, clearly off track. And now we look at these pictures. But is this summit the start of coexistence, or simply, let's say, a tactical pause before the next clash? Because in the larger scheme of things, can two tigers inhabit the same mountain?
Well, I'd like to point out this is the third effort made by the Prime Minister to reset ties with China, and I'm not sure that this effort will succeed where others have failed. Please, as you know, the Chinese believe that there can only be one tiger on the mountain, and they don't even want the US on the mountain along with them. They're conducting a hybrid war on the US. There's nothing kinetic, but they're conducting a war through social media, and they're making people in the US clash, political clashes, other kinds of clashes. So there's a full-scale kinetic war with the US. So far as India is concerned, if they won't even tolerate the US and have two tigers in the mountain, I don't think they're going to like India joining them, that is the Chinese, on the mountain. The more so because the rate of growth in India is now much faster than earlier rates of growth were in the past. And frankly, the Chinese are very happy about one thing, and that is the seeming rift between the US and India. But I'd like to point out that a number of Indians have landed in Alaska. This is which is where the Trump-Putin summit was held, and they're soldiers, and they're there to conduct joint military exercises with their US counterparts. So quite frankly, yes, the Trump tariffs are, frankly, quite a problem, but the overall relationship is still healthy. And as the Commerce Minister very correctly says, efforts are being made to ensure that there is a mutual convergence of interest on that. It cannot be one-sided. It's got to be mutual. So I think from that point of view, the question is, Can we get that, or is that not going to happen? But until we get that, we're not going to sign
No,
any
right,
deal.
Professor. Professor Nalapat rightly said, and if I could just come in here for a bit, it's definitely a question of either or, and if India and China really should be on the same page, it can only be in the interest of mutual ends that both these countries seek out for themselves. If I could just very quickly come over to Mr. Joshi for a bit. You heard Professor Nalapat, they're talking about how, it's a relationship that's bound to be a little strained given all the history between both these countries. But I have to ask you, sir, Mr. Joshi, how do India and China, given this new context of bonhomie that has now come into the picture post-SCO, how do you reconcile all the competition, confrontation, and, well, cooperation, if you will, that might now creep into the picture? How do India and China go about reconciling this as both countries look to turn over a new chapter in their relations, Mr. Joshi?
See, we have been doing this for quite some time. We have what I call the 4 C's: conflict, cooperation, containment, all this has been happening, and competition. So all this has been happening together. But at various points in time, one or the other of this has salience. For example, right now, we are in the mode of cooperation and competition. But earlier, we were in the mode of conflict and containment. Now, this has been happening almost from the very beginning, meaning India and China became republics around the same time, 1949, 1950. And since then, these two Asian giants, this has been the feature of their relationship. That is, sometimes there is conflict, sometimes there's cooperation, there's competition has always been there right through. And this cooperation business, we have seen SCO is one example of this. The BRICS is another example of this. So there are periods, meaning if we can extract something from competition and cooperation, we should go with it. But at the same time, we have to be prepared for conflict. And we have to also understand that China is trying to contain us in South Asia. So we need to see, and we need to work with other countries to contain China in a larger Asian setting, in an Indo-Pacific kind of a setting. So I don't see anything contradictory about it. These are all permutation and combination of things that have been happening right from the beginning of the founding of the two republics.
Right, Mr. Joshi. In fact, an imperative point that you make that multi-order has to happen, and more importantly, like you talk about the permutation and combination. But again, coming back to you, Mr. Joshi, given what we've seen on the SCO platform as well, which showcase partnership in trade, investment, and energy, of course, but the ground reality at what we see in terms of confrontation and mistrust, which has been at the borders, is this duality sustainable, or is the contradiction, Mr. Joshi, bound to collapse at some point? How do India and China reconcile that aspect?
You see, obviously the border is one major issue. And I personally don't see why that border cannot be resolved. The border is not being resolved because the Chinese are trying to use the differences on the border as a means of trying to dominate India. Meaning, whenever we have seen in the past, from 2013, 2014, 2015, 2017, 2020, we have seen these little border incidents. They're actually in themselves pretty minor. But these minor incidents are used to unsettle India. And as long as the border remains a line of actual control and it is not transformed into an international boundary, you will have this problem. So the Chinese find it very convenient, not to settle this border issue. Though we have been trying, we have signed agreements with them. We have had, 23 rounds of talks of special representatives who are supposed to resolve the border issue. But yet, this continues. And as I said, the reason why it continues is because the Chinese very conveniently find it useful to have an unsettled border so that they can constantly, irritate India, constantly create minor crises, very minor crises on the border, which
No, absolutely.
lead to a
Joshi,
problem.
I hear you. The fact remains that absolutely the Chinese side has often used the border issue with India as leverage, and that's in fact a reality we've contended with more so now than before in the last 5 years, especially post the Galwan clashes. In fact, that's a good time to bring in Professor Nalapat into the discussion back again. You heard Mr. Joshi there, Professor. Do you feel, and I know I might be putting you on the spot, but this is really the million-dollar question that's on everyone's mind. Do you actually see a reality in these times where India and China can actually settle the border dispute for good, Professor Nalapat?
I'll give you an example of the concessions, quote unquote, that the Chinese make. They finally accepted that Pahalgam was a terror attack. Great. But they have not said who was responsible for the terror attack. Let's say that someone suffers a terror attack and someone in a family is murdered. Then the police come and say, well, we found the murder weapon, but they know the perpetrator, but they won't name the perpetrator. They won't do anything about the perpetrator. So it's definitely a Pahalgam terror attack in the joint declaration of the SCO is a step forward. But the reality is that you're basically saying that we have the murder weapon, we have identified it, and we know. Off the record, they know, we know that they know who was responsible. It is Pakistan, but they won't name that. Now, I'm not sure that anybody in any family will be satisfied if the police say we have the murder weapon and they refuse to identify the actual killer, even though that they know the killer. They know who the killer is. In fact, they're the ones who supplied very valuable assistance to the killer when that terror attack, killers, if I may say so, when that terror attack took place. So I just want to say that, as far as trade is concerned, $100 billion deficit is unsustainable. And the Chinese would like it to become $150 billion or something like that. But the reality is India is now going to produce, as the Prime Minister said, a huge amount of tech that's in direct competition with China. A lot of goods that India produces and which India will then retail across the world will be in direct competition with China. And the Indian costs, in my view, will, thanks to regulations being eased and thanks to GST rates being cut and rationalized, they will be, the Indian cost effectiveness will be as good as the Chinese, if not better. And many democracies, given the inequality, they would prefer to buy from India. So I think the future for India is good. The future is bright. But if you're looking for a future in which the two, China and India work in harmony together, both overtly and covertly, I stress that fact. Overtly, of course, Pahalgam attack, XYZ, very friendly, fine. But covertly is, their activities against India, including on the online
Right,
front.
Professor Nalapat.
But they have
In a
covert
sense, there
warriors,
might
that
be
continues.
limitations as far as how these relations can probably also go. But taking a cue from what you did say, Professor, we will come back to you. But Mr. Joshi, taking a cue from what Professor did talk about, right? Given how for decades China has cultivated Pakistan as leverage against India, and even if she talks partnership with Modi, is China ever likely to give up that strategic card? Will China perhaps stop using Pakistan to unsettle India? Mr. Joshi?
Not until we establish our clear-cut superiority in the South Asian and Indian Ocean region. I don't think they will, because they have found Pakistan a very useful instrument. From 1962 onward, 1963 onwards, they have understood that using Pakistan's, what should I say, uh, hatred for India has been very convenient, and right through they have systematically supported Pakistan. And that systematic support has been fairly dramatic. Not many people know that it is actually the Chinese who helped Pakistan build a nuclear weapon. In 1982, the Chinese transferred designs of a nuclear weapons to Pakistan. They provided the materials for it. They tested their nuclear weapon in 1990. So, if you went in that sense, China has been the only country that has breached this taboo, which is considered a taboo, a nuclear taboo, and supported Pakistan. So in those circumstances, I don't see them giving up their leverage vis-a-vis India, because it's very convenient to have Pakistan, because Pakistan has this blind hatred for India. So for China, this is an ideal instrument. But if India is able to establish, and I think this has been a major challenge for Indian diplomacy, we have not been able to break the China-Pakistan nexus. And this is a challenge to Indian diplomacy. But if we build up our national strength to the point where we become a dominant force in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, I think the Chinese will be forced to reconcile with the situation.
Right. Right. No, you rightly said it, Ms. Joshi, but the fact remains that if Pakistan is one part of the problem, another issue that India has had with China has been the rapid pace of infrastructure development that the country has carried out unabated along the border. In fact, let me bring Professor Nalapat back in here again. If there should be any thaw in Indo-China ties, at least as far as the medium term is concerned, will a lot of it also be dependent on India's demands and asks that China slow down or perhaps even stop its rapid pace of infrastructure development along the border that it has carried out so unabatedly in the recent past, Professor Nalapat?
Look, I agree with Manoj, quite frankly, whatever he has said. And I want to point out that the Chinese are particularly worried about the fact that the services sector is expanding at very high speed. And services are taking an increasing role in the gross domestic product. And services exports are also high in India. For example, I mean, so many exports of services are rising in India. And you have this important thing about India was in China is that the Chinese have got a demographic decline. Let's face it, the Chinese demography is not in their favor. There's no youth cohort. There's no youth cohort whatsoever. In fact, the population is in decline and has been for quite some time. Although some figures will say no. India has a youth cohort. And the reality is that what is needed is to train that cohort and make it, friendly to the 21st century. And given the innate intelligence of the Indian, and of course, the Chinese people as well, I'm not denying that. But I see that would be a very important challenge to us to ensure that the youth are trained to handle modern jobs, especially tech. And in my view, if they spread all over the world, that's fine, because knowledge can flow back to India from partner countries, and that's a good thing for India. The reality is that the demographics favors India, and it certainly doesn't favor China. The services growth is really something that the Chinese have got their eye on. Chip making is something they got their eye on. EVs is something they got their eye on. You, as I said, you name the product, and you'll find that the stiff competition in cost and prices for China will come only from India. So I can only say that the medium term, short term is very, very rocky. The medium term is good, and the slightly longer term is excellent where India is concerned. Thank you.
Right, Professor. In fact, as you point that out as well, Mr. Joshi, coming back to you, given what we heard professors say more about how the demographics clearly favors India and the services growth as well. But I also want to ask you this, given what China has promised, the supplies of rare earths, and of course, crucial for India's EV and renewable ambitions as well. But in the larger sense, do such assurances mark genuine economic interdependence, or are they just pressure points that China can perhaps weaponize later, Mr. Joshi?
Well, when it comes to China, they will definitely attempt to weaponize it to the extent they can. But at the same time, the Chinese also need India, meaning they're already having problems with the United States. But India is a huge market. India is a huge destination for investment. And as Professor Nalapat has pointed out, that this has a huge services sector, which is extremely useful for any hardware development as well. Meaning China may be doing very well in the field of hardware, but they definitely need the software that India can provide in a much more reasonable form, cheaper form than anyone else. So what I'm trying to say is there are parts of the system where cooperation will work. I'm saying we in India need to set up an ecosystem for manufacturing. And for that, we need China. And we have to understand that we need China, we need Chinese manufactured products, we need Chinese engineers coming here. Now, the thing is, we have seen in the case of iPhones that the Chinese restricted their engineers from coming here. In the case of EVs also, they will try the same. So this will be, this is, as I said, right at the outcome, there will be a phase of cooperation and competition will go together. And our job is to ensure that this does not degenerate into conflict. Neither China nor India can really live with conflict. Certainly, as a large, poor, developing country, India needs a peaceful periphery. So to the extent we can do it with self-respect, I think we should move in the direction of cooperation and competition with China.
Right, right. And of course, Mr. Joshi, let me also quickly ask you, given the fact that the India-US ties are merely seeing a bit of a blip at present, at least that's something that we've established a while back, do you feel a more medium-term friendship between India and China can actually take form and shape amid India's closeness to the United States, the trade deficit issue notwithstanding? Can China really overlook India's closeness with the US should this relationship bloom and grow, Mr. Joshi?
See, in the last 70 years, we have been close to the US at various points in time. And we have been close to the US even now. My own feeling is that as long as we don't cross the red line of becoming a formal military ally of the US, I think the Chinese can live with it. And I think we really don't need to cross that red line because, we are a nuclear power of our own. We are a major military power. We don't really need US boots on the ground or US security in the manner that Japan or Western Europe does. So I think our closeness to the US is really geopolitical. And it is, of course, directed towards balancing Chinese power. But the Chinese, I think, are smart enough to understand that it's their behavior which often triggers this. So if they understand this, but as I said, the red line is that we should not become a formal military ally of the United States. And I don't think there's any danger that that will happen.
Right. Well, on that note, Mr. Joshi and Professor Madhav Nalapat, great to have you with us, sharing these perspectives. Thank you so much for joining us and breaking this down for us here on ET Now.